different actors from different regions and countries to the table to discuss what a just transition should look like. So for us, essentially, a just transition is really about making sure that the decarbonization processes that we need to tackle within our economies and societies happen in a socially just and inclusive manner. As you might know, the just transition movement originated in the US in the 1990s when trade unions were negotiating measures to phase out jobs in the chemical sector. And it was really about their jobs and livelihoods. Then this topic really took off with the ILO Just Transition Guidelines that were published in 2015. And then at COP, with the just transition and the need for a just transition mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. We've also seen a lot of progress after that with the Powering Past Coal Alliance that came into being at COP 23 in 2017, the Silesia Declaration on Just Transition in 2018 in Poland, and at COP 26, this very exciting and groundbreaking new initiative for a just energy transition partnership with South Africa. And for us, really, I think achieving a just transition is not possible if you don't keep 1.5 in mind. So it's actually a prerequisite to keep 1.5 to achieve that just transition. And another very important principle is that, and this is what I've mentioned at the beginning, is that this just transition should be inclusive and socially just. So the most important principle is that no one should be left behind in this transition, and that we maximize climate action while also bringing all affected groups to the table and minimize the negative impacts of climate change and climate policies. And there's also obviously a strong connection with the climate justice movement, where we see that countries that are least responsible and most affected by climate change must benefit from that transition. And last but not least, we believe that in all societies, making sure that climate policies are done in a socially just, participatory, and inclusive measures is really crucial to create acceptance for the need to combat the climate crisis. And it is important to win over as many progressive actors as possible for this issue. And this is why we decided to organize this side event today, to provide a space for different actors from different backgrounds and different countries to exchange their perspectives on a just transition and to really strengthen the work on just transition in this way, also in this space here. And for that, we really do have a fantastic range of speakers. So without further ado, I would like to start and hand over to our first speaker, who's also the co-organizer of this side event, Nithi Nesadurai from the Climate Action Network Southeast Asia, who will talk to us about different just transition challenges in the energy sector in Southeast Asia. Nithi, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Hello, everyone. What I'd like to do is highlight the busy and exciting landscape on just transition in Southeast Asia and beyond, and also explore ways in how we can create synergies between all the positive actions which are going on just transition in the region, and end with two exciting announcements. At least I hope they'll be exciting to you all as well, on some recent developments. So first of all, I'm very happy that CAN Southeast Asia, through our partnership with FES, has allowed us to be involved in the just transition conversation since 2017. And this has also enabled us to get involved with a project known as IKIJET, or the Innovative Regions for a Just Energy Transition project. So this is a consortium which comprises International Labour Organization, International Trade Union Confederation, Climate Action Network, International Institute of Sustainable Development, and Wuppertal Institute. And it's focus on two countries. One is India and one is Indonesia. And we are very privileged to be involved with the project in two active coal mining regions in Indonesia, where our role, which I think is the most exciting, is to get engaged, to have stakeholder engagement with the communities in particular. And with an emphasis on procedural justice, like who gets a seat at the table to ensure that the the voices of the vulnerable communities, are heard, sort of women, the sort of disabled, the local communities, and also the matter of procedural, distributive justice, who gets what, because by the process of just transition, we don't want those who have benefited from the previous system to benefit even more. We have to make sure there's equity when we have just transition. On another related note in terms of what's happening in Southeast Asia, FES and Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and CANSEA organized the inaugural Just Transition Forum in 2021, Just Transition Forum in Asia in September last year. And based on the positive response, this has now been institutionalized, and it will be held every year from now on. Now, just reflecting on, I mentioned that the Just Transition space has become busy. Just to highlight that CAN had a webinar in sort of middle of 2021. And that time we had people talking from South Africa, from Canada, from Turkey, from India, from Indonesia, talking about all the activities that they were doing, different groups were doing on just transition already. And then, and even like there was even a presentation on just transition in transportation. And then as an observer, the civil society observer to the climate investment funds and a member of the advisory group on evaluations and learning initiative, case studies, very detailed case studies have already been created on energy transition in South Africa and India, water governance transition in Colombia, and sustainable land use in Ghana. And they've also created a Just Transition Toolkit. So this is a great opportunity to use their tools, as I'm sort of a part of the advisory group. And then subsequently, we are going to embark on the 4-year project in Indonesia in September. Of course, in preparation for this, we were part of a scoping study from March to September last year to prepare, the sort of details for the project implementation. And subsequently, after we had completed the scoping study, just by chance, the Asian Development Bank presented a case study on just transition in Indonesia. And we got invited to that, which was very similar to what we are hoping to do with the IKIJET project, the 4-year project. And when they asked, who else would like to come and share what they're doing, in Indonesia, the World Bank got up and said, oh yeah, we are involved. The Swiss Embassy got up and said, we are supporting a project. The Netherlands Embassy got up and said, we are supporting a project. So it shows, the interest on just transition. And of course, at the UNFCCC level, we have the Katowice Committee on Impacts, or the Katowice Committee on Experts on the Impacts of the Implementation of Resource Measures. They just had a side event, and they're also talking about just transition. So it's, there's a lot of work going on all over the world. Now, just in 2022, I'd just like to highlight some civil society initiatives which have crossed my desk, which we in CANSEA have been invited to be part of. Carbon Care InnoLab, based in Hong Kong, had a Just Transition in Asia event. The World Animal Protection and 50 by 40 is leading on just protein transition. And they had a series of consultations this year with about 40 networks and organizations in preparation for the Asian Communique on just protein transition. So, and I had the huge honor of launching the Asia Communique last Monday at a side event organized by World Animal Protection and 50 by 40. Now, the Porticus Foundation is about to commence work on just transition in cities. Newcastle University did a study on just transition in forestry in Southeast Asia, supported by the British Academy under the Just Transition to Net Zero program. Yesterday, Oxfam in Australia told me that they've got clearance to do a 5-year program to support engagements with organizations in doing just transition work in ASEAN. So this is all very exciting, and this is tremendous. It shows the amount of excitement and interest in just transition, which is great. And two ideas which I'd like to enable synergy. So I talked about creating synergy, and two ideas which I have to enable the create of synergy from all these positive intentions of all the different actors are as follows. Of course, the basic premise is that justice will be at the center of our work on transition. So the 2 points are, one is have a mapping exercise listing all the different actors working in the just transition space so that we are aware of what each of us is doing, so that we can learn from each other, complement each other's work, avoid duplication, and avoid having different actors going to the same targeted communities and making demands on them, and then build on each other's competencies. And the second is to create a platform where all the different movements and networks can come on a platform together with movement of movements. I said there are two exciting things, and one is, as mentioned about the mapping, 2 days ago, there was a launch by Climate Justice, Just Transition Donor Collaborative in partnership with CAN. They launched the Climate Justice, Just Transition Compendium with a view to center climate justice and just transition at the center of all future COPs with the support of the philanthropy donor communities. So they have launched this compendium, which actually does the mapping. So they have, and it's open, so all of y'all who would like to include yourselves in the compendium, especially if you're doing work on just transition, they'll be delighted to list you there, and also provide profile for what you're doing on just transition with the donor community, with the philanthropy community, so they'll be aware of you. That's one, and we are helping them compile this compendium and critique it, and prior to publication. The second one is, I mentioned about creating a platform where all civil societies are involved in just transition, where they can engage and build off each other. Climate Action Network is in the process of setting up a civil society global platform on just energy transition, with the objectives of creating a deeper understanding of just transition, highlighting principles of just transition, and getting just transitions into the national NDCs, or the nationally determined contribution. And trying to mainstream just transition into government policy. So it'll become a knowledge hub as well as a coordination hub, which a place for sharing best practices and having a strong, coherent narratives amongst all the different actors working on just transition. So I just wanted to highlight that and just inform that it's a very exciting time. It's a lot of activities going on, and that we should all collaborate with each other, and to create synergy in the work that we're doing on just transition. And I'll stop here, and then if there are any queries, we can take it up on question time.
Yeah, thanks, Nithi, for this very broad overview. I think it would be very interesting to delve deeper into the different narratives, maybe also different interests of certain stakeholders. But before we do that, I would like to hand over to our second speaker, Jeremy Anderson. He works for the International Transport Federation. And now we move on from the energy sector to the transportation sector. And I think this is interesting because obviously the challenges are quite different. But we also see that in particular with the transportation sector, some very impressive work has already been done. So Jeremy, you have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you to FES and CAN for organising this event. Just transition is obviously a very important topic for us to be discussing at these climate change meetings. And if you're not familiar with the International Transport Workers Federation, so we are the Global Federation for Transport Trade Unions, and we represent, or our affiliated unions represent around 20 million transport workers across the world. And that is all transport modes, air, land, and sea. And just transition is a major focus for us. And as you would expect, as a trade union, we're very focused on the worker dimension, as Yvonne was talking about, in terms of the Paris Agreement and also the ILO guidelines being a key focal point for us. But we also see kind of building alliances as very important to our just transition work. But in terms of kind of our approach, we think it's really important when we look at the dynamics in the different transport sectors to understand that just transition and climate change affects kind of workers in different sectors in different ways. And so we think it's really important to develop a specific approach. But in addition to that, while on the one hand, for us, just transition is about making sure that workers are not made to pay the cost of the transition, so protecting existing standards. And in my mind, just transition in the labour context is often about dealing with the threat of job losses, and that's always going to be an important part. But there's also a second dimension of just transition that I think is equally important and which doesn't get talked about nearly as much. And that is, what happens to those industries where the issue is not so much job losses, but the changes to jobs and the changes to communities. And how do we really engage workers in the transition process? And this is important because it's very clear to us that there won't be a just transition, there won't be any transition without the full involvement and the full engagement of millions of workers around the world. This will never work as a top-down process. And the only way that we are going to mobilise workers in large numbers if we can make it relevant to them. So when we look at this question at the ITF, there's three kind of different industry scenarios that affect three of our industries, which I'm going to talk about now: aviation, shipping, and public transport. But I think these scenarios are also quite relevant beyond the transport sector as well. And so when we think about aviation, that's definitely a contraction narrative, although I put a question mark there. But the threat of job losses is something that is associated with just transition in aviation. When we come to shipping, it's quite a different scenario about adaptation in terms of how existing jobs are going to be impacted. And public transport, it's more of an expansion dynamic. It's very clear that public transport needs massive investment, but that also brings its own challenges. So I'm just going to talk about these in a bit more detail. So in terms of aviation, definitely our most challenging sector when it comes to just transition. I make no bones about that. And one of the most contentious questions is the question of future growth. And also, given the criticism that the aviation industry receives from social movements, there are concerns amongst many aviation workers about future job loss and what this looks like. The position that we have adopted is that we accept that there needs to be a cap on growth. So we do not agree with what ICAO, which is the UN agency that regulates aviation, or the employers are saying, that aviation can continue to grow based on offsetting and unproven technological changes. But we do think that the aviation has a very important role in the future economy and society. And so what our approach is to build a vision of what a sustainable aviation will really look like. We think that investment in decarbonisation measures in aviation needs to be massively ramped up. But at the same time, we think it's very important to upgrade labour standards in the industry at the same time. So when we talk about sustainability in aviation, it's both social and environmental. So that's an early stage. But I just want to move on to maritime, where the discussion has been quite different, where there isn't this threat of job losses hanging over workers. But maritime also needs to go into a very rapid transition. And we went through a process where we identified what is this going to mean for workers, i.e. seafarers, in the industry. And some of the themes we identified were health and safety, for example, alternative fuels like ammonia, potentially very toxic, but also in terms of kind of what skills seafarers will need and making sure that seafarers will have access to good quality training. But perhaps one of the main things I want to talk about here is the global, is the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, which is the first Just Transition Task Force that has been established at industry level. And we launched this at COP26, and with what we see as the key stakeholders in the industry. So that is the employers, the International Chamber of Shipping, the UN Global Compact, the ILO, and also the International Maritime Organization. And the focus here is to work on practical projects, such as the main thing we're working on at the moment is a study on future skills needs. But making sure this is not just about transition business as usual, this is also about raising standards, addressing, frankly, is the industry's terrible problem with gender inequality and gender segregation. So we want to bring in that transformative aspect of it as well. And now I'll just move on to the last example, which is public transport. And so this is a sector where we think, on the face of it, it looks easier to mobilize workers around just transition because there's a lot of agreement that kind of modal shift from private cars to public transport is very important, and public transport needs to expand. However, that process is going very slowly. And here we see it's very important to build alliances. We've got a great example from COP26 last year of a demonstration for public transport with some local groups in Glasgow. And here that's an alliance around not just good labour conditions in public transport, but also making sure that public transport is accessible to all by making it free, for example. And so that's just one example, but I also want to highlight like another project that we're working on, and my colleague Bruno in the room is leading this, where we are building a bottom-up approach to just transition in 7 cities in the Global South. And that is bringing together kind of groups of unions in the public transport industry and using an action research methodology to help those unions identify what does just transition mean to them, and how can they organise around just transition, not just to both decarbonise the sector and to improve labour standards at the same time. And I just want to give one example from the Philippines of one alliance there, where we found that the alliance between the union, the NUTC, and a civil society organisation around electrification of minibuses, which is a big theme in this project, really helped both in terms of our union, in terms of understanding the environmental issues, and the civil society organisation in terms of understanding the importance of labour standards and what the worker concerns were. So those are just kind of 3 examples of kind of how we are doing just transition in different scenarios in the ICF. And I think one final reflection to conclude is that particularly through our work in these different coalitions, also the Maritime Task Force, what we find is that there is like a lot of ambition to include lots of different stakeholders around just transition. But our perspective is it's very important that we build a solid foundation around kind of the work issues in just transition based around organised constituencies, because we don't want it to be watered down. We want just transition to have a solid foundation. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremy, for presenting these very impressive examples for the different sectors that you outlined, and also already hinting at some of the challenges when it comes to maybe conflicting interests that maybe we can delve into discussion a bit further. But before we do that, we now come to three very exciting country perspectives on just transition. We have three more speakers with us who will provide inputs in their very own, very unique and important perspectives of how their work on climate action and just transition is going in their own countries, in their own contexts that are quite important, quite relevant at the moment. So we will start with Thando Lukuko from Climate Action Network South Africa. He's with us virtually. I hope he can hear us. And yeah, hi. So we've already talked a little bit about the Just Energy Transition Partnership that was formed at COP26 in Glasgow last year. So I think we're all very excited to hear a little bit more about your perspective on just transition in South Africa and how that just energy transition is going. Thando, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you for having me on the platform. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Sorry.
Cool. So I'll start with just a bit of background on the just transition, including the context of South Africa's just transition, and then bring it up to speed to where we are today, including some input on the just energy transition partnership. So, as we all know, South Africa comes from a history of apartheid, and so part of that apartheid is it really separated the development of across different class lines, right? And so when we look at South Africa, it's a society that's characterized with high inequality, high unemployment, and high poverty as part of this, and really it was in part due to what's called the minerals and energy complex, which we had at the time around 1948, the introduction of very heavy emitting organizations or companies start their businesses. So it was largely mining and extractive industry was what bolstered South Africa's economy into the 50s up until today. And today we're still largely characterized as a high carbon emitting economy. And so when we then move into the post-apartheid era, one of the challenges that had to be addressed is how to expand this electricity and electrification to a wider audience, a wider community, which included then those who had previously been without. So it really touches on the justice aspect. And this is now your previously disadvantaged communities. And so at the time, there were no new facilities that were built to provide this capacity. All of it was just expanded upon with the existing coal fleet, which then exacerbated the energy intensity of the economy. Because obviously, as you could imagine, more electricity needed to be produced both for industry, but also for those who had not had electricity, which also then contributed to then South Africa now experiencing difficulties in providing much of its electrification. And so one of the last significant things which happened, I think, in the early or late 90s, early 20s, to 2000s at least, was that there was this recognition that we need to begin to diversify our economy. We need to diversify the manner in which we produce electricity. And we also need to roll out more widespread and more affordable electricity to those communities that hadn't had in the past, which really formed the basis of what South Africa's definition of just transition, right? Particularly the justice component. So when we now touch on the issue of just transition, I won't speak of just transition as a subject, because I think we're all quite familiar that it's largely born from the labor movement. And so what I will speak to is just in recognition that it needs to happen and where it started for us early, is where some of the significant pieces were. There was a platform called the National Planning Commission, which was responsible largely for the visioning of where South Africa's low carbon economy could land itself by the year 2050, which economic sectors would be prioritized to to be low carbon. Chiefly, it was our electricity sector, which is the single largest carbon polluter of our economy. Second was agriculture, and then transport, and then tourism. And then the NPC was responsible for essentially designing that roadmap, which included extensive consultations with different sectors of society, including those most marginalized. And so it addressed, at least from a theoretical perspective, some of the socioeconomic issues which characterize South Africa. It tried to respond to some of the economic needs of the country at the time, including where it is that we wanted to be by the year 2050. Following which, there was agreement to the decarbonizing, at least, of South Africa's energy sector, and primarily South Africa's electricity sector. And so questions around how does then that get financed began to emerge. And at the time, it was known as the Just Transition Transaction, which is essentially the precursor to what we have as the Just Energy Transition Partnership, that 8.5 that currently exists. And so it looked at the various mechanisms that South Africa could engage the international community on, which would allow for us to achieve our Just Transition ambitions, including whatever necessary programs that would need to be financed in achieving this goal. And then following which was then the setting up of what's called the Presidential Climate Commission. And then the commission, by extension, developed the Just Transition Framework. The PCC, as it's known for short, is so it's a platform for where social partners come together, and really it was to engage and negotiate and deliberate on the issues specifically needed to be implemented by the Just Transition. So literally the tangible issues. And some of the stakeholders included business, labor, civil society, and government. It sits with, I think, 23 commissioners. 10 of those commissioners are from the different government ministries, including the ministers. And the idea is that it's got presidential oversight, which would coordinate all of the functions and all of the rollout of South Africa's Just Transition. But also it would advise then the state on what would be the most ideal pathways that South Africa can take in its pursuing of the Just Transition objectives, the low carbon economy by 2050. To which end, what emerged from it was this Just Transition Framework document, which in part was also extensively engaged upon by various communities, particularly communities in hotspot areas like Mpumalanga, where it's our coal belt, in communities like South Durban, where we've got oil refineries, and where the communities are living around the fence line of some of these facilities are most impacted. So it went some way to try and ensure that those voices are heard, including the participation of the different stakeholders that are not represented within the PCC. So some of your rights-based organizations, your science communities, and the like, so that whatever emerged as that final document was as representative as possible to what the South African context is, and how it might factor in particularly the justice component to those who have not had in the past, and how that bridge might be built. And so, as we currently stand, we've now submitted that Just Transition Framework. I'm happy to say that CAN sits on the steering committee of that document. And what we've been able to do is we've now had this document. It's informing the president on what are the likely steps. It's at a stage now where we're going to be moving it to implementation through what's called the Midterm Strategic Framework, which essentially is what government uses to inform what programs are going to be funded through the fiscus, so that it can roll out then its Just Transition efforts. Then it brings us then lastly to the Just Energy Transition Partnership. The 8.5 that was mentioned at COP26 is intended to primarily finance, let's call it, the pilot project that is South Africa's Just Transition, right? We've got the national utility, which is the single largest indebted organization in the country, the single largest and one of two largest organizations responsible for most of our carbon emissions. It's our electricity generator. And so I think something like 75% of its fleet is still from coal-fired power stations. Most recent estimate is that our economy is still 80% powered by coal. almost 85% powered then by fossil fuels, with the additional component coming from nuclear. And now the idea behind the Just Transition Framework partnership is that it will finance the national utility to pivot away from its coal value chain into the renewable energy value chain and the green hydrogen and electric vehicle industry. And the idea is that as then the national utility begins to scale up its decarbonization projects, that 8.5 is essentially the beginnings of what will be financed, but it will also, upon a successful implementation of these projects, unlock additional financing. The current estimate for what South Africa needs for its just transition is around $250 billion. And so you can imagine that 8.5 is just a drop in the ocean for what is needed. And so at the moment, conversations around the Just Transition Partnership, since it's been announced at COP, let me say from the outset, no money has yet transferred between the two, between the partners. It's from what we've heard, we're still setting up the governance structures. What are the modalities for that financing? We're obviously more inclined to move towards some kind of blended mechanism and concessional financing, with the idea that South Africa is not interested too much in being more indebted than we currently are. And so the idea of loans is not one that we're trying to push. However, suffice it to say that some of the governments, and I don't know if this is a platform to mention which governments, but if you ask me, I might just mention them. Some governments are more amenable to providing more concessional finance and others not so much. But there isn't yet, as I said, any money that has been transferred between the partners. So in closing then, just what kind of alliances do we think in light of this would need to be built? The JET partnership, right, has been characterized as a government-to-government negotiating platform. It's been blatantly said that civil society won't have too much of a space to participate in that, which is something that we're fighting back strongly as civil society, because of course we've got the necessary skills, we have the capacity to engage on the issues, even though we might not necessarily be a government organization, but we can inform the level of negotiations and inputs because we have done some of this work ourselves as civil society. So the participation and involvement and partnership through other civil society networks across the globe to pressurize both the South African government, but also the UK, France, EU, and the US to create the necessary space for civil society to participate, both in the South African shore and in the shores of the respective countries as well. The second thing is then, as I've said, the PCC is moving towards the implementation phase now of the Just Transition plans for South Africa. Part of that requires that we then connect with other countries that have also started to implement parts of their plans, or any kinds of frameworks that they're also using to be able to inform their implementation. So that could be civil society networks, that could be private sector networks, that could be government networks, but access and availability of that information is crucial for South Africa to understand, including for us to be able to communicate back to the world, particularly how it is that we address the socio-economic components of the just transition, because in a country like South Africa, as I've said, right, we've got the highest Gini coefficient. So us addressing the issue of the just transition, decarbonization of the sector, cannot happen in the absence of addressing some of these socio-economic issues. And of course, some of these are also characteristic of other countries. And so that's information that we think we could share together with other partners, as I said, both in civil society, private sector, in the government sector as well, and by extension, labor too. And then lastly is, so it's just what we've recognized, and particularly a lot of the consultations in the respective communities, is that the issue of just transition is economy-wide, right? And one of the things that it does require is that there becomes, similar to the conversation of climate change, there becomes a widespread conversation of what is the challenge, what is the need, and what plans are in place for us to be able to address it. To be able to do that effectively, it means conversations about this topic, as complex as it might be, need to happen with the layperson in the street. This, in turn, adds pressure on the political principles to recognize that the electorate is wisening up to what the issues are. They're wisening up to the potential solutions that are on the table, and that the responsibility of those political principles to act in favor of their electorate only works to their benefit. Because again, despite what they might think, they're dependent on the electorate for their next terms. And so the more we find creative ways and interesting ways in order to engage the public around some of these complex issues, how to demystify some of them, how to make them really consumable to the layperson is something that's critical. Yes, South Africa has got some history in doing this, but of course we don't have all the answers, and that's another avenue where we think a certain level of partnership with our international colleagues will really yield quite a lot of. So for now, thank you, colleagues. That's the end of my submission. Thanks.
Thank you, Thando, for that call to action, also for providing a bit of an eye-opening overview of what has been promised and what has been achieved so far with regard to this JET initiative that was launched so glamorously at COP last year. So I think there's also a lot of work to be done, a lot of action to be taken, in particular by trade unions, by civil society, to make sure that they are at the table when it comes to these negotiations, also with potential other countries in the future. Now we move on to another country context, or another regional context, where this is Angelina Davydova. She is currently based in Berlin, and she's an independent Russian environmental journalist. And she will talk to us about what the just transition looks like in the specific context of Central Asia, the Caucasus region. And of course, at the moment, it is we cannot really talk about a just transition in a politically empty space. So obviously there are particular challenges when it comes to Russian civil society engagement in the field of climate action and just transition at the moment. So of course, Angelina will also address these issues and also talk about what is needed, both from international side, but also from civil society, to make sure that independent Russian civil society can continue with their work. Angelina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'll start with a few personal facts. I am indeed a Russian climate journalist and an expert in Russian climate policy, and I've been attending the UN climate negotiation process since 2008. Unfortunately, in middle March this year, I decided to leave the country and come and stay in Germany because of the current events happening back in Russia with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many other fellow colleagues of mine, also other journalists and other NGO experts, also some experts in the area of climate policy, also had to leave the country. So unfortunately, the current conditions for civil society activists, for experts in the area, and also for journalists, not been very favorable, even though they've also been becoming even more complicated in the last few years in the run-up to February this year. So I'll start by saying that current conflict, the war, which is now taking place in Ukraine, obviously has some local impact on environmental and climate policies and situations with both countries, both Ukraine and Russia. It also has global consequences. We will not go that deeply into them at this very moment because I've been asked to speak more specifically about the region as a whole. However, if I were to mention just a few important facts and a few important trends which are currently taking place, I would say that ever since the beginning of the war and ever since the international sanctions and embargoes on Russian fossil fuels, including oil and gas and coal, quite a lot has been happening within Russian environmental and climate context. Quite a number of legislation has been rolled back, environmental legislation and also legislation in the area of climate regulation and greenhouse gas regulation. Russia does remain a party to the Paris Agreement. Russia does declare its commitment to its climate goals, even though these goals have not been very ambitious, as we know. So far, in words, it all remains the same. In practice, we'll have to see. There's quite a lot of push from the side of the business community, including large energy producers who are pushing for environmental and climate regulation to become more flexible and less restrictive, even though it has not been that restrictive, as I already mentioned. And at the moment, there's quite a few very interesting trends, which I believe very few countries have experienced in their recent history. For example, right now in Russia, we experience an abundance of oil and lack of oil processing facilities, which makes for quite a number of oil companies to actually push to switch natural gas plants back to oil and back to heavy oil. And likewise, closing of quite a number of trade routes between Russia and the European Union also means bad news for gas flaring. Gas flaring is an important environmental and climate issue. And within the last few years, actually, Russia has had some achievements in that area, which were even acknowledged by the World Bank experts. However, now, due to sanctions and due to ceasing trade with the European Union, quite a number of oil companies are also pushing for more relaxed regulation of flaring gas. That means not catching the flaring gas and not processing it, but rather burning it again, which is once again not good news for environmental and climate global and international agenda. So unfortunately, I do foresee that within the next few months, we'll see even more rollback of environmental and climate regulation within Russia, not in words, but in practical actions. And even though, as I say, within the political agenda, Russia remains to be party to the Paris Agreement, and Russia officially remains committed to all the targets which it had before. So that was my short overview of what has been happening in Russia and then within Russian climate debate and within Russian climate policy since the last 3 months. And I would like to expand my view and tell a few more words about what has been happening in the region, which has an abbreviation of ECTSA, or Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Caucasus. This is indeed a region which has been largely underrepresented for many years at the international climate negotiations. And also, like within many contexts, there's very little understanding what's actually been happening in the area of climate policy, in the area of just transition, also in the area of civil society participation in the country. So I should mention that the countries of the region have really began active players within the international climate policies rather recently. Some of them have renewed their NDCs last year. However, with most of the countries of the regions, NDCs still remain very unambitious. And one of the reasons for that is that with most of the countries in the regions being the post-Soviet countries and also affected by the serious economic downturn in 1990s, many of them have experienced the so-called phenomena of the hot air, meaning that the countries have actually seen their emissions going down without doing anything. It just happened because of the economies went down in the region. And so in absolute figures, if we look at the emission patterns and if we look at the emission scenarios, emissions of most countries of the regions have actually been on decline and maybe just growing a bit in the last few years. That also leads to the fact that NDCs of most of countries in the region, with an exception of Ukraine, Georgia, and to a certain extent Uzbekistan, have actually been, rather, as I said, rather ambitious and actually meaning either staying at the current level of emissions or even growing emissions a bit with regard to the previous years. This is once again connected to the fact that the emissions have been going down throughout the last 10 and 20 years. Quite a number of countries in the region have also announced their goal to reach net zero, and the countries which did it last year were Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and also Russia. We'll have to see, obviously, what happens with Russian and Ukraine goals, also with regard to an ongoing war at the moment. Also, quite a number of countries have mentioned coal phase out, Ukraine and also possibly Kazakhstan. And many countries also mention increase in renewable energy. And actually, we've seen some modest development of renewable energy, specifically in Georgia and Uzbekistan. This is also the countries which have been announcing further plans with regard to solar and some wind energy. However, for some countries of the regions, nuclear and large hydro energy also remains to be high priorities. And those are also arguable and contradictory points for many countries and also for local communities and also for civil society groups who are working with the topics of energy transition and just transition. I should also mention that in the end of last year, a very good report, which was prepared by the CAN, the Climate Action Network, CANSEA, so Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Caucasus, which analyzed the developments of renewable energy in all of the countries of the region. So if any of you are interested, I'll be happy to share that report. Now, more specifically to just transition, to the region, it's a comparatively new trend, and it's a comparatively new idea, and there is not so much discussion going on at the moment. I would actually like to point out two country contexts in which just transition came very vivid and very noticeable throughout the last and this year. So one of these countries was Kyrgyzstan. So when Kyrgyzstan was discussing its new NDC, a lot of attention was given to participation of civil society groups. And some of these groups have also come with an idea of just transition being an important point in drafting climate action and climate strategies for the country. And another country of the region, also from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, where the low-carbon long-term development strategy is currently being discussed within the expert community and also with the community of the civil society experts. There, an issue of coal region transformation and also oil region transformation is also a very important point. This is also something which is currently being discussed, and so just transition remains to be a very important point for the current discussions. I should also mention that all in all, involvement of civil society experts and also experts from other sectors into drafting climate doctrines, into drafting climate documents is somewhat limited in most countries of the regions. And some of this because of the political hurdles and because of political barriers for civil society groups and experts to be involved in these processes. In other countries, it is more about lack of capacity or support structures for civil society groups to be involved, to get professional, and also to become more active, also in putting ideas forward for just transition and further decarbonization plans. I should also mention climate finance. It's a comparatively new but very big topic for the region. Here, once again, in the last few years, we've seen quite a few programs opening up for mainly the Central Asian and Caucasus countries of the region. Here, once again, checking accountability, seeing how transparent the projects are, what is actually being done, how relevant it is, whether just transition is also being part of this project, whether the projects also address issues of social justice, and whether they address issues of resilience. So all these topics are still new. So accountability and transparency of climate finance will become a very important topic for the region. Likewise, climate risks and adaptation needs. If we look at the Central Asian countries, then it's obviously an issue of water and water security, and likewise agriculture and agricultural production. All this gets connected into a very complicated nexus with the climate risk, water security, and agricultural production and food security to be tied together. And those are also issues which need to be addressed together. And this is also where we see the climate debate getting stronger and also getting more connected with experts from also water and agricultural areas. And here's once again where just transition experts and also civil society experts are certainly will need to have a stronger voice. And finally, another area where I believe an issue of decarbonization, an issue of just transition will be very relevant for the region within the next few years. It's an issue of urban transformation. Most of the countries are highly urbanized countries in the region. And what we see is the need for urban reconstruction to be renewed, to be modernized. And this is also, once again, climate risks plus water-related risks plus many other aspects from sustainable transportation to renewable energy in cities, to air pollution, to many other aspects. This is where, well, first of all, the voice of civil society and involvement of civil society is due to become stronger. But this is also where we have to look at how most impoverished communities can deal with this, and also where the whole issue of just transition within the city context and within the urban transformation, also green urban transformation, can take place. And anyway, this is going to be one of the main points for climate-related actions within the country context. And then finally, to sum it up, there are quite just very few groups in most countries of the region who are actually working on just transition. And in general, as I said earlier, just very few civil society groups have been working on environmental and on climate-related policies and agendas in the region. So I believe interaction and dialogues between these groups in the region of Central Asia, Caucasus, and Eastern Europe with other groups, including groups from the Global South, is actually very important and very crucial. Unfortunately, as I also said in the beginning, the region of CANSEA has been rather underrepresented in the global climate debate, but also in the global interaction and common action with other civil society groups. And I believe it is certainly a task to be addressed, and it is also certainly an area where a lot of cooperation programs with various respects, from just transition to urban transformation to sustainable transportation, can actually take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina, for this very broad overview, both of the role of Russia in the current political context in the UNFCCC, but also this broad overview of the just transition challenges in the whole region. Now, I think from one crucial actor, quite relevant actor when it comes to COP27, Russia, we move on to probably the most important country when it comes to achieving a successful outcome this year in Sharm el-Sheikh. Haneen, she's with us. She's from the Climate Action Network Arab World, based in Egypt, and she will talk to us about the specific challenges that we face when it comes to the role of Egypt in organizing COP27, but also the role of civil society in achieving a just transition and organizing climate action more broadly. Haneen, you have the floor. And I'll hand the mic to you as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's so true. The problem in Egypt that when we talk about just the transition, it's all about private sector and the government action. And it's very sad that all the progress that takes place in Egypt when it comes to the energy transition and the natural gas and the solar panels and all these mega projects is totally happened and took place without the consultation or the engagement of the civil society. And unfortunately, it's because it's a very huge complex of current situation where the civic space is very challenging in Egypt, and when it comes to the level of engagement of environmental civil societies and the presence of them as well. But it's still, there is no national dialogue that takes place when we talk about mega projects that can sustain people's life in the future upcoming. And like, for example, we had this successful Bimban solar panel project in Aswan. However, it faced a lot of challenges when it comes to the rights of the workers there and the how it is considering the human elements into the project and into the livelihood of the people who are working in. And it's not only in that, the urbanization taking place in the capital and across the cities, and the transformation happening in the transportation systems and all the kind of things totally happened without any level of engagement from the civil society or the local people who are going to face all the upcoming consequences of these actions taking place. And honestly, it's totally looked at from the perspective of how the money is used and how the private sector is going to be benefit out of it, and how to bring more investment, to bring more money, to make more projects, which is good. However, there is a very most important element that the people who are going to work in these projects are not included. With the upcoming COP, we are hoping, and honestly, that's the narrative that's been like promoted and sold to everyone in Egypt, that the civic space is going to be more open. There are a lot of engagements going to take place, and the civil society is going to be engaged. However, it's very hard to tell whether, if we say that this project is not good for the environment, or it's not addressed the basic rights of workers' rights, is it going to be considered as a bad investment or not? This is a very big question that we know that's going to be faced with a huge, like, fight back. So, yeah, however, there are few companies and few startups, few civil society members who are trying to push back, trying to issue reports, do researches, give advice and consult in order to bring the best scenario out of what is happening, because it's already happening and we cannot, this is the way of fight back what is currently existing, but it's not going to be as beneficial as if we are going to be more included. So the projects that Nithi and you talked about is brilliant, and me thinking about why we don't have this in Egypt is like killing me, because that's exactly what we need in order to achieve the right engagement when we want to see the proper just transition. It's very important for us to not only be included in the initial talk and planning about the projects, it's very important to be across and monitor, observe the whole process of the implementation of the projects, because we are the civil society, the link between the private sector, the government, and the actual people who are resident in the place the projects are taking place. And we are the promoters of the sustainable jobs that the transition is going to create. So if that language is not the same between all the pillars, it's not going anywhere to what we want to achieve in the proper transition. And letting all the negotiations and the deals sealed and done in closed rooms between governments and private sector, honestly, is going to like be fought back from the people, and that's not what we want. We want a proper, coherent projects that can sustain and can achieve the goals of the agreement. And yeah, that's it. I think so for me.
Thank you, Haneen, for this very concise overview of the challenges of just transition in Egypt. Now, we do have a little bit of time left, actually quite a lot of time left for questions from the audience. So if there's anyone who has a question for one or more of our panelists, please feel free to raise your hand. And I think there's a mic that we can pass around. Now, I do have a lot of questions myself, but I would like to give you the floor first. So I see 3 questions. Maybe we can combine them and then ask for collective answers. Is it on? Yeah.
Speak.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation and to this event. It's so interesting. And I have a question particularly to the transport trade union. And maybe the others want to answer as well. It's about job losses. So I see why it is a threat to welfare of workers and their families. And also I see how work can be a threat to welfare, overwork. And I wonder in whether we can achieve a just transition if we are always worried about jobs and not about what jobs are supposed to provide for people. So can we offer proper housing and nutrition and everything that people need without jobs? Because we can give jobs and people still don't get what they need from it. Thank you.
Shall we take a few more questions? Yeah, is that okay for everyone? So I would suggest we take 2 more, and then we give everyone a chance to reply.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alden Meyer from E3G in Washington. I'd ask all the panelists, what would be the most helpful thing to you in your country or sector that this process could deliver in Sharm el-Sheikh? I mean, we were going to adopt a mitigation work program, which obviously will have elements of just transition in it and may request or invite parties to do more on just transition, including inclusion and consultations in development of their NDCs or their sectoral initiatives. We obviously, since a while, have had the Katowice work program on response measures, which has gotten into this. We have preambular text in the Paris Agreement about the need to deal with just transition. We weren't able to get operational language in the Paris Agreement, but we could try to get some more hooks in there in Sharm el-Sheikh. So just what would be most helpful to you in advancing the just transition agenda and movement building in your countries or your sectors? Thanks.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sandra Prüfer. I'm a journalist, so I have a question for you. But I'm also representing Parents for Future, and this was being more your direction, but to all panelists, basically. Now, the Parents for Future, they have joined this fossil fuel treaty initiative, and you're probably all aware of this. Third pillar is the just transition. And the COP27 also be framed as a African COP, and countries there very much affected, but also, maybe potentially, leapfrogging the energy transition, so there's potential for renewable energy. On a practical point of view, how can, in this more like resort location, actually be there in engagement with civil society and in particular also from the global south? And let's say, the scope could have been in Alexandria or in another location, but it's really hard probably for civil society, but it's hard for you to get on this table, but how can maybe then civil society from outside reach there and yeah. So my second question is Russia and the former Soviet Union countries so heavily depending on fossil fuels, but at the same time being very much affected by climate change and global warming, melting of the Himalaya glaciers, but then also the Arctic. Russia has now the presidency of the Arctic Council. There was a report 2 weeks ago from the Alfred Wegener Institute that by mid-century, literally the Arctic tundra in Siberia could disappear. Temperature rise is already over 2 degrees. At the same time, there's more expansion. More opening of gas and oil fields. And the people that are actually living there are indigenous people. I lived in Alaska, so, Chukotka, and I know that region. So is there any way that under these conditions to that the local population and community can be engaged, because I mean Russia has not yet left the Paris Agreement. So I mean, could there be some? Is there a discussion going on? So that was my question.
Okay, thanks a lot. A lot of questions. So I'd suggest we try to answer these questions first, and let's start with the first one on jobs. And Jeremy, I would like you to answer this question first, but of course the others are welcome to add. Do we need? I think it was essentially, do we need jobs, or what kind of jobs do we need?
Thank you for asking this question, because I was very brief when I was talking about our work, but it raises a very important point for us, which is when we talk about the transport sectors, whether it is aviation, shipping, public transport, it's very important for us to talk about transport as a public good. So not just about providing jobs for the sake of it, but about what good does this sector provide to society. And that leads us into a very different place where we are now, which is where the market decides based on price, like how many flights there are, how many resources are allocated to these sectors. Whereas we're saying, partly because we're very clear that we need much more government involvement in these sectors in order to really drive decarbonisation at the pace that it needs to go. But also because it raises the question about what do we really need these sectors for? We need more democratic oversight, and we need to think very carefully about what the social good to society of these sectors is.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to the jobs question?
Yeah, I'll add.
Nithi, please feel free to jump in.
So when we talk about just transition, it's moving from a sector which is highly carbonized to a sector, to an alternative which is either a low carbon or ideal situation, a sort of zero carbon economy or development for that matter, and basically creating and that process should lead to something an alternative which is just green, humane, and sustainable future. So that's the transition we'd like to see. And that, of course, that it leaves no one behind. I talked about distributive justice and procedural justice just now. And of course, my context is, like I said, 4-year project in 2 active coal mining regions in Indonesia. So people living in the coal mining region, actually, it's quite horrible. So anything could be better. So on the matter of jobs, what our process aims to do is actually to go to those communities, in living in those who are dependent on those coal mining regions for their livelihood, and to have a conversation, inclusive conversation with them, where we'll try to include as broad the community as possible, including those who will not easily come to engage and share their views. Like going to the voiceless, the marginalized, the powerless, and getting all their views to see what is their vision of alternative livelihoods. So it's something, this is something we need to test out. We haven't done it, so we're going to do it. Of course, there are already academic papers on, in this region of East Kalimantan, for those who are dependent on coal mining, the 3 top industries they can transition to are tourism, agriculture. These are academic papers, so we really need to test it, and we really can't be top-down. We really need to get their views to move into, what, as you asked, what the new jobs will look like. So that's something very exciting. And another thing which I also didn't mention is with this project, it's got the support of the Indonesian government. So they are behind it. And what we'd also like to see is that as this project goes on, there will be all these frameworks which are created where there'll be a permanent consultative mechanisms between the administrative areas or the provincial governments with the communities, which doesn't end once the project ends. that these are the mechanisms which are created, which will facilitate an ongoing discussion on just transition, which we see as a long process. To answer Alden's question...
Oh, what? We haven't come to that yet.
Oh, sorry. Okay, beg your pardon.
No worries.
May I also have a short comment on
Yeah, a very short one, please. Yeah.
I would like to make maybe a rather general and also somewhat theoretical comment, but this is also a kind of topic I've been thinking a lot recently. And I feel like, indeed, when politicians speak about jobs, they do it in many ways because so much of political debate everywhere is about simplification. It's hard to speak about complex issues. It's hard also to speak about complex solutions. For example, right now, when many of the world problems, from security to food security and food sovereignty to energy to climate crisis, are so much interconnected, how do you really communicate the solutions which address all of these sectors at once and which address them at systematic level? In a way, we're used to thinking in terms of like ministries or sectors or, I don't know, departments. And now as we come up in a new stage of the global development, which on one hand is becoming ever more interconnected, on the other hand, we also see now negative consequences of this interconnectivity with regard to coronavirus, for example, or with regard to the current ongoing war. So I feel like now it's obviously time for new solutions and new policies, which will be cross-sectoral and which will not be only about GDP growth or jobs or some other very simple, very catchy, very kind of, just sexy figures. And we need to find out the solution, and we need to communicate them differently. We also need, there's a lot of, I almost feel like education and communication needs to be done in this area. And it's also like when I was hearing you speak about the transport transformation, I caught myself thinking, look, there's so much being said about how many jobs will be lost in aviation and maritime transportation. But then if we look up at global transformation of public transportation sector, those are amazing opportunities, like all sorts of new jobs. And it's also true that until recently, I would say in most country contexts, public transportation has not been a very lucrative or sexy sector, right? It kind of old and, I don't know, traditional and not very innovative. But now it's time to change this. I remember a couple of years... Sorry, I realize I'm running. Okay, so I'll probably stop here and, thank you.
So maybe just a very short comment on that. Maybe that's an oversimplification, but obviously when we talk about unjust transition, what we don't mean is a status quo. What we mean is transformation of jobs into high-quality jobs, into good jobs that are organized with the support of labor unions, that are well-paid, that provide living wages for people. So we don't mean, so this is also an opportunity to really transform these jobs into good jobs. Is there anyone else who would like to add to that question? If not, I would like to move on to the other two because we have one more person waiting and only 10 minutes left. Nope? Okay. So we had two specific questions for two of our panelists. One was regarding, I guess, why they chose Sharm el-Sheikh as a place to hold COP27 and what you see as the potential opportunities for civil society to even have some sort of engagement there on the ground. So Haneen, you have the floor.
So actually, like planning for Sharm el-Sheikh as a place to be for COP is the most obvious example on how the inclusivity it is, and actually the approval of the place itself from the UN. They know that it's a resort. Everyone knows Sharm el-Sheikh is a resort. Everyone knows it has like 90% of its hotels are 7-star hotels. This is how it looks like. It's the same as Cancun, the same as the places they are okay with it to go and talk about climate change. So it's not only internal problem, it's a UN problem that they agreed on it. It's a very, very good example of how they are planning to engage and include several parties of the communities toward the negotiations. And what we can do is that we have to push till we be there, because it's what is happening, like what happened in Glasgow last year with the tremendous refusal of visas, the huge blockage of people, the location of the green zone itself, comparing to the blue zone, how far it was another statement of how they want the civil society to be included in the negotiations. It's every year getting more severe on the exclusion that takes place. And it's just different title of the government, different name of the country, but it's the same scenario. It happens every year, different strategy. Now in Egypt, it's the hotels and accommodation drama. Last year, it was the visas dramas. And so nobody knows when it's going to happen next year. And this year, and this week actually, SBs, the Yongo just said that they had a very huge refusals for accredited people to come and attend the SB. So it's a global thing. And honestly, governments replicate what other governments did. Like the government of Egypt, or the presidency of Egypt, is going to say, it happened in Germany, why you are like, it happened in UK, why you are commenting on our attitude? But what we have to do is that we have to keep pushing that we are going there. We have to mobilize our presence, the importance of our presence, even virtually, because it's really, really important that we oversee what is happening in these meetings and these conventions, and to bring out these work plans that we can work on and build the right transition that we are looking for. And honestly, the mega problem that is happening as well with our exclusion, that we are facing a huge false solutions. And these solutions are impacting everything that we are working on and impacting the future of the businesses and the jobs that we are going to look at. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we have to keep on pushing to be there.
I'm going to take the mic away from you because you only have 5 minutes left and we've been asked to not go over time, so I'll try to stick with the schedule. Angelina, there was a question regarding Russia's role in the Arctic Council.
Right, yes, I'll try to address it very quickly because we don't have much time, and then I'll be open for further conversation after the event if you're interested. So first, a short comment on many countries of the region being large energy producers. I would like to comment that not all of the countries in the region are large energy producers. Well, Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, indeed so, but then some other countries of the regions actually rely on energy imports or local energy solutions, including hydro energy, which is obviously also arguable in current conditions. Now, with regard to the Arctic, it is indeed so, and also international and domestic Russian climate scenarios show that it is indeed moving in this way. Unfortunately, current conditions and war conditions, and also cutting of many ties with Russia, also means less scientific cooperation with Russia and less data available both from Russia to the global scientific community and from the global scientific community to Russian scientists. I mean, we'll have to see how the situation develops also with the war and what will be the situation after the war. But at the moment, many of international cooperation projects, also with the Alfred Wegener Institute and many others, have been put on hold. Now, with regard to the indigenous communities, they are indeed those communities who are impacted the most by the consequences of climate change, the one you've mentioned. And on one hand, they've been speaking about it, also within Russian context and international context. For example, here in Bonn, we have representatives of a number of Russian indigenous communities who also spoke earlier today at another side event just a couple of hours ago. On the other side, within Russia, a number of independent or critical indigenous communities are also being politically oppressed. And many of them face direct or indirect pressure also to speak openly, for example, against the companies or against oil and gas exploration or against plans of regional government to build more infrastructure in their traditional livelihoods. So it's a somewhat politicized question. And for many of these communities, it's hard and it's actually dangerous to speak up and to speak against.
All right. Thank you, Angelina. We have 5 minutes left, and there's one open question that was asked, and I'd like to conclude the panel by answering this question. And I would like to give 1 minute to each panelist to very briefly tell us what kind of outcome they think needs to be delivered in Egypt based on their own needs and experiences related to a just transition. So what do we need to see in Egypt? What do we need to see happen there at COP27? And maybe Thando, we haven't heard from you in a long time. Are you still with us? You have the floor if you're still there.
Yes, I am still here. Good question, Alden. I think for us, it would be putting a squeeze on any future subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Our biggest stumbling block is a continued reliance and addiction to wanting to continue to invest in fossil fuels. And so, yeah, that would be my response.
Excellent. Thanks for a very short and precise answer. Who would like to go next? Haneen.
I hope that we can have a work plan that can replicate or that show all the voices from everyone. We want the Global South to be part of it, and we want everyone to really observe and make sure that there are no false solutions are putting on the plate.
Thank you, Jeremy.
I'd like to see the Glasgow Just Transition Declaration that made a condition for climate finance. So in the trade unions, we get worried sometimes that just transition can be a bit watered down and include everything but trade unions. But I think that just transition declaration from Glasgow is a very good basis, and that should be used as a condition for climate finance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nithi.
Yeah, the group working on response measures for the Katowice Committee on Experts had a side event just before this, and that's the question I put forward to them. And so two things, and they were asked, why isn't their work going on, as a technical committee, why isn't their work going on to the main body? So two answers. We want, as Bert from ITUC asked them, want a place at the table with them, not as observers, so we can contribute as a partner. Number two, we want a decision coming from them which goes into the final text, which sort of requires all parties to create an institutional mechanism, institutional framework to mainstream just transition in their respective countries. That's what we want.
Thank you. Angelina, you have the final word.
So, I agree to a lot what has been already said by other panelists. From my side, I would add that for the region I was speaking on behalf of, so Central Asia, Caucasus, and Eastern Europe, yes, climate finance and climate finance programs, and also like accountable and transparent, and also climate finance programs which tackle various kinds of climate action in the region, including just transition, is obviously crucial. But then maybe also another argument, something not directly connected with the level of UN negotiations, but rather what else is needed in the region for just transition. Good stories about just transition happening elsewhere and being successful. I think this is also something being needed. And also, as I said, more cooperation with other actors from other regions, including the Global South.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for listening, for contributing. I know we were not able to cover all of your questions, but we'll be around for a while, so please feel free to approach us, as we said, if you have any further questions. Thanks to everyone, and best of luck for the rest of your time here.
It's very hot in this room. Yeah, it is very hot. Wonder why.